Hello, everybody. This is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Part 3, Chapter 19. Vronsky, in spite of his worldly life and his apparent frivolity, was a man who detested confusion. Once, when still a lad in the school of pages, he found himself short of money, and met with a refusal when he tried to borrow. He vowed that thenceforth he would not expose himself to such a humiliation again, and he kept his word. Therefore, in order to keep his affairs in order, he made, more or less often according to circumstances, but at least 5 times a year, an examination of his affairs. He called this straightening his affairs, or, in French, faire sa lessive. The morning after the races, Vronsky woke late, and without stopping to shave, or take his bath, or put on his kittel, and placing his money and bills and paper on the table, proceeded to the work of settling his accounts. Petritsky, knowing that his comrade was likely to be irritable when engaged in such occupation, quietly got up and slipped out without disturbing him. Every man whose existence is complicated readily believes that the complications and tribulations of his life are a personal and private grievance peculiar to himself, never thinks that others are subjected to the same troubles that he himself is. Thus it seemed to Vronsky. And without inward pride, and not without reason, he felt that, until the present time, he had done very well in avoiding the embarrassments to which everyone else would have succumbed, but he felt that now it was necessary for him to examine into his affairs, so as not to be embarrassed. First, because it was the easiest to settle, Vronsky investigated his pecuniary status. He wrote in his fluent, delicate hand a schedule of all his debts, and found that the total amounted to 17,000 rubles, and some odd hundreds which he let go for the sake of clearness. Counting up his available money, he had only 1,800 rubles, with no hope of more until the new year. Vronsky next made a classification of his debts, and put them into 3 categories. First, the urgent debts, or, in other words, those that required ready money, so that, in case of requisition, there might not be a moment of delay. These amounted to 4,000 rubles, 1,500 for his horse, and 2,500 as a guarantee for his young comrade, Venevetsky, who had, in Vronsky's company, lost this amount in playing with a schuler. Vronsky, at the time, did not want to hand over the money, though he had it with him. But Venevsky and Yashvin insisted on paying it rather than Vronsky, who had not been playing. This was all very well, but Vronsky knew that in this disgraceful affair, in which his only share was to be guarantee for Venevsky, it was necessary to have these 2,500 rubles ready to throw at the rascal's head, and not to have any words with him. Thus, he had to reckon the category of urgent debts as 4,000 rubles. In the second category were 8,000 rubles of debts, and these were less imperative. These were what he owed on his stable account for oats and hay to his English trainer and other incidentals. At a pinch, 2,000 would suffice. The remaining debts were to his tailor and other furnishers, and they could wait. In conclusion, he found that he needed for immediate use 6,000 rubles, and he had only 1,800. For a man with an income of 100,000 rubles, as people supposed Vronsky to have, these debts would have been a mere bagatelle. But the fact was that he had not an income of 100,000 rubles. The large paternal estate, realizing 200,000 rubles a year, had been divided between the 2 brothers. But when the elder brother, laden with debts, married the Princess Varya Cherkovaya, the daughter of Dekapritz, who brought him no fortune, Alexei yielded to his share of the inheritance, reserving only an income of 25,000 rubles. He told his brother that this would be sufficient for him until he married, which he thought would never happen. His brother, the colonel of one of the most expensive regiments in the service, could not refuse this gift. His mother, who possessed an independent fortune, gave her younger son a yearly allowance of 20,000 rubles, and Alexei spent the whole. Afterwards, the Countess, angry with him on account of his departure from Moscow and disgraceful amour, ceased to remit to him his allowance, so that Vronsky, living on 45,000 ruble footing, now found himself reduced to only 25,000. He could not apply to his mother to help him out of this difficulty, for the letter which he had just received from her angered him by the allusions which it contained. She was ready, it said, to help him along in society, or to advance him in his career, but not in his present life, which was scandalizing all the best people. His mother's attempt to bribe him wounded him in the tenderest spot in his heart, and he felt more coldly towards her than ever. He could not retract his magnanimous promise given to his brother, although he felt now, in view of his rather uncertain relationship with Madame Karenina, that his magnanimous promise had been given too hastily, and that, even though he were not married, the 100,000 rubles might stand him a good stead. He was prevented from retracting his promise only by the memory of his brother's wife, the gentle, excellent Varya, who always made him understand that she should not forget his generosity and never cease to appreciate it. It would be as impossible as to strike a woman, to steal, or to lie. There was only one possible and practicable thing, and Vronsky adopted it without a moment's hesitation: to borrow 10,000 rubles of an usherer, which would offer no difficulties to reduce his expenses and to sell his race-horses. Having decided upon this, he wrote a letter to Rolandaki, who had many times offered to buy his stud. Then he sent for his English trainer and the usurer, and devoted the money which he had on hand to various accounts. Having finished this labor, he wrote a cold and sharp note to his mother, and then taking from his portfolio Anna's last 3 letters, he reread them, burned them, and, remembering his last conversation with her, fell into deep meditation.